In order to understand the archaeology of the farm, it's helpful to know the history of the farm and the history of the process of farming. So, for a logical starting point, I would go back about 500 million years. May seem a long way, but it is established that the rainwater came out of the sky at the Lehigh Valley and Appalachian Mountains, and then it came down across upper Bucks County, and the water flowed underground until it hit Bowman's Hill, Salisbury Mountain, Buckingham Mountain, which were harder stone that caused the water to actually turn. For the most part, for our purposes, it turned left and came over toward the Delaware River through the streams of Salisbury and a little bit of Buckingham. The point of this is that the valley that we think of here was particularly well watered and well fertilized over millions of years. And so it became very fertile farmland. It was heavily occupied by Indians starting around 10,000 BC. Hard to tell any particular date, but it certainly was in that era. And the first problem was, of course, the Indians lived peacefully in the woods, but the white man wanted the woods cleared in order to plant, in our case, wheat and other crops. There are essentially two ways to bring down a tree. You can either take an axe to it, and we will see one of those axes in the collection. Otherwise, you strip the bark off the side of a tree for about a foot all around it, and that cuts off the sap, which causes the tree to die. And then it will be felled with an axe. And of course, in this area, there were superb white pines, hemlock, oaks, and any variety of other useful trees, which the white man and the Indians put to use. The first date that makes significance here was 1682, when William Penn landed to claim his province. And so he started the process of the manor, M-A-N-O-R, which meant that you had a little bit of everything: animals, plant material, lots of people. And it is only in the 19th century that you get specialization, which changes from the manor. But you can see the manor at Pennsbury, lower end of Bucks County. The next signal event was in 1704, when Cutler marked off steps along the Delaware River every roughly 500 feet, notched a tree as the corner of a property, and then that was listed in the inventory to be sold or given away by the Penn family, following which he would walk another 500 paces up the river and mark off land. This particular property was just part of that series, but it's where the river begins to turn, and in terms of checking this particular landscape, it's a little bit more difficult, but it worked. In 1735, a few years later, the first part of the house was built, as shown on the card picture of the farm map. It was only 2 years later that the Penn sons initiated the walking purchase from Wrightstown on up into the Lehigh Valley. It was a ripoff of the Indians, but it established a quasi-legal ownership of this particular land. So it's a little confusing that the farm was underway and the house was built by about the time that we got around to buying the land from the Indians. With the farm, of course, we had by that time cleared the land. We were growing wheat being the most valuable product for both people here in Philadelphia area, but it was shipped in round barrels to England and to the West Indies. Might point out just in passing that the British call it corn, and the place where they traded wheat or flour was called the Corn Exchange in London. The existence of wheat was the most important product, and so there was extensive wheat growing and the building of mills. Far more than ever took place in England for a couple of reasons. Number one, we had more fertile land, and therefore we could grow wheat better here. In addition, the English people were undergoing something called the Enclosure Acts, which meant that a big landholder could evict his farmers that grew the wheat and insert sheep instead. Sheep are easier to raise, they take less manpower, and those country farmers either went to London for the Industrial Revolution, or some of them came to America, which will account for the fact that we had very sophisticated mills all along the Delaware River. The particular section of both fertile land and water and people is between the Pawnakussing, between Lumberville and Carversville to the north, and the Aquatong Spring that came through New Hope to the south. Strangely, that is much more fertile and productive than land to the north, which allowed the water to flow right through, and to the south, as in the Makefields, where the water went down into the ground into a sandy soil that came off the Jersey Shore. So for reasons that had nothing to do with us, we suddenly landed in this absolutely beautiful part of the world and a fertile farmland to go with it. The number of mills per creek is a little bit mind-boggling. There were 5 different mills on the Pawnakussing. There were more than 5 mills on the Aquatong or Ingham Spring coming into New Hope. And that's far more than would have been taking place in England at the same time. But it made for a very fertile and very prosperous area with rather beautiful houses, such as this one. There are more handsome houses per 100 acres here than there are anywhere north, south, or in New Jersey. It just happens that the rainwater washed down against the mountains, subsequently turned left and went underground in limestone caves over as far as the Great Spring or Aquatong Spring, which is now Aquatong Park, and that's now a Sobey Township Park. The result of this is that by the middle of the 19th century, after the Revolutionary War, we had supplied England with flour, but we ran into a little difficulty shipping flour to the enemy. So the combination of expansion to the west and the building of railroads meant that the wheat crop changed in America and became less, perhaps not less important, but less export. But there was definitely export, as we will see in the barrel hoop in the collection. After that, there became a concentration of farming. In this particular case, it was orchards. It was the Civil War that changed the configuration of farming around here. Up to that point, it would have been wheat almost exclusively. But with the increase in population and the availability of big open land in the Midwest and lots of people coming in and the building of railroads, it was more economic and more profitable to grow wheat out west. And so there was specialization here. For our purposes in Salisbury Township, there was a particular concentration on orcharding, and we had apple and peach crops growing here. They ultimately moved further south to warmer regions, but there were probably 400 or 500 acres of fruit trees in Salisbury. And that, of course, was augmented by crazes. We had a craze for merino sheep in the 1840s, and people thought that they would make millions by raising sheep. It was a fad, but it did not survive. Anyway, by the time I got here in 1953, all of the fields around here were in tired, old orchard trees that had outlived their usefulness and were really not able to come back to full productivity. So that particular concentration was piled up with a bulldozer and burned with a lovely smell. There were other kinds of concentrations of horticulture around the area and some ornamental floriculture, farming of daffodils and tulips and things like that. And it became a concentrated economy as opposed to the manor. Might refresh, the manor was such that it had a little bit of everything. It had significant amounts of people. It would have had cows, which we had 3 or 4. It would have had horses before the tractor came in the 1920s and 30s. This farm had pigs, it had goats, and would have had other vegetables to support an all-round economy. However, as time went by, even that changed. And that particular economy is based on family concentration. As soon as the young people discovered the city and industry, they moved on. So the families of 8 and 10 disappeared. The next stage is where we are now, which is a total change of environment. It is now the land of the gentleman farmer. The owner of the property, me, does not do the farming. I rent it out to either a local farm neighbor who grew sorghum or soybeans or corn and occasionally wheat. But as time goes by, he passed away, and I now rent to a hay farmer. The Windy Bush Hay Farms supply a lot of hay in this township and others. And the point is that they have heavy-duty, concentrated equipment and farm a lot of properties, such as mine, where I sit on the lawn and enjoy the view and take advantage of a new provision, namely the conservation easement, which meant that I was paid by the township or equivalent authority to own the property but not develop it, because the real crop in this part of the world is housing development. And so there's a conscious effort in recent time to sign up big properties for conservation easements with the intent of at least maintaining the beauty of the properties and some level of productivity without building high-rise housing developments. So the whole environment of the farm has changed, but one would say much of the beauty of it is lost, and the existence of archaeology continues hidden under the lawn. This is the collection of prehistory, and my friend who was down in the bottom of the field, he still had the rack on top with the head attached, which is rather unusual, and it shows what a deer head would look like. If you come closer to modern day, you can see the rack that he might have dropped off a few years along the way, as the deer do every spring. And here he actually had an accident and lost both jaws. So my friendly dentist said, "Humph, needs cleaning." We have to recognize what was in the ground around here, but this was a chunk of coal which would have come in around 1835 when the canal began to operate. So we know that at the farm, coal was used for heating and driving mills ultimately. It's a rather large piece. We've had an interesting discussion of the clams and oysters as to whether they came by train from the Jersey Shore or they came out of the ground here. We looked them up on the internet and found that there are 10 or 15 different kinds of shells and mussels to be found in Bucks County. And the easiest place to go see them is Ringing Rocks, which is a park area in Tinicum Township. So these are all prehistory items that turned up on the farm, and obviously the folks ate reasonably well. When it comes to porcelain for the house and living, it's a little more difficult. This is a piece of what is called feather edge ironware. Ironware being the basic material, and the blue feather edge was very popular in the 18th century and continued into the 19th century. As I mentioned elsewhere, we don't really have the results of the trash of the 18th century. In due course, we'll probably find it, but this at least indicates the type of plateware that would have been common. Here are the only two pieces we found. The more common are sheets and bowls of this nature. This particular one, of course, has no identification, nor really does this. But the shape of it suggests that it's either a large food bowl or maybe a potty that would have been under your bed at night. That, of course, would have been very common because the outhouse was a long ways away. What we did find in ironware was much more intriguing, and here it is. You can zoom in. That these are pieces, and sadly, they're of course only pieces of ware that have significant identification on them. And we don't have a full name and address. Originally, ironware was popular in England from the late 18th to all through the 19th century, and it looks like these may even have been seriously broken. We can't tell, but there were English firms in Liverpool that made what is called ironware, and we have a breakout of their existence here from the New Jersey State Historical Society, and it leads us to one charming conclusion, that there was a company, I don't have the name on my head, but it will say it was Jones and Smith. It was Jones and Smith in London, but it was Smith and Jones when it came to Trenton, New Jersey. So clearly they had an agent or a member of the firm in both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Clearly this was finer ware to be used on the dining room table. We've never found quite enough of it to identify the whole works. This is an offshoot, probably local clay. There is local clay in Trenton area, so this may well have been made there. It might have been a stand of some kind and decorated for pottery. This also just shows the level of technique, the level of ability of the makers of the late 19th century. And we have lots and lots and lots of chips of white ironstone. It's almost as though not only was the plate broken, but they proceeded to break it up a little bit more. Here is another kind of pottery that's common throughout northern end of Bucks County. It is Pennsylvania Dutch sgraffito ware. It's very popular. It's rarely more than a plate, a platter, a dish. It doesn't get up. I have not seen cups or really articulated features, but they're marvelously decorated and still made by many people in that area. And so they're quite fun to have found. This is a piece of slag, the point of which is we know that it would not have been before 1835 when the canal began to bring in coal to this part of the area. And so that I have a reasonably large amount of coal in different sizes that were burned here. These are all domestic items. This is rather domestic in its own right. I would suggest that it's 20th century because of the design, but I'm sure it was in heavy use for a period of its life. On the other hand, here is a brass doorknob. Why a doorknob was loose in the middle of a field, I'm not quite sure, but it's a rather nice piece, and one would think that it would have been of value in its day. We have only the piece. Here is some rather domestic ware, namely the equipment for a kerosene lamp. And it's just indication of the fact that they would have gone from candles to ultimately electricity not long before I bought the farm in 1953. But it's an indication of the type of lighting that would have been common. The actual plateware is fairly simple and a good deal thinner than we are used to. So none of this matches. This is a pair of scissors and, of course, a beer can opener and maybe a letter opener and related piece to it. Here is a two-prong fork, which would have been the common usage before we got to four-prong forks as of today. We're going to the collection of bottles, which is surprisingly full. It has a lot more sizes and shapes than expected. A medicine bottle, probably powerful stuff because it is so small and it would have been costly to acquire. But it's a joy to have a solid piece of it. It does not have enough marking on it to make its origin clear. This becomes the next size, maybe a pill carrier. Yeah, again, there is no identification on it to make it clear. This one probably is indicative of an ink well. And the concept was that ink being a very strong stain, it wants to be wide at the bottom so that it won't tip over when you put your quill pen in there. It's an interesting shape and has very little use otherwise. This has local insignia on it, but I have not deciphered it yet. We'll get to that. This clearly is an older medical bottle. There is a large body of knowledge about these bottles that are rectangular and fairly deep, and they were medicine bottles of various sorts. And then we come to modern ones, and here is a bottle of Moxie. Moxie is an earlier version of Red Bull, and a little bit of this, and you feel much better. It probably was used in small amounts, but on a regular basis. In the same family, and probably from the 20th century, is this little plastic treasure. Clearly, someone had an evening, but this much liquor would probably be just a few dollars, but you'd feel much, much better as a result of it. The next one is a very heavy-duty bottle, and it is clearly marked LaRue Bottling Company. LaRue Bottling Company was on Lower Mountain Road, the other side of New Hope from here, and was in operation for many years. It, needless to say, is not operating now, but it is a treasure of local origin. And sad but true, very few people, the younger generation, really know about milk bottles. When I settled out here in 1953, the Gardenville Farm dairies used to deliver by truck about 6 or 8 quarts of milk once or twice a week when we had a family here. And it's a piece of history because milk now comes in cardboard containers. And so it is pedestrian in its own right, but it is part of the history of beverages and service in ancient days, and probably will not return. And this is a real treasure. This is a bottle of liquor, not milk, but as you see, it has been shot and probably with a .22, and the bullet has gone in the one side of the bottle with such velocity that it came out the other side of the bottle without destroying the rest of the structure. That's a trick. And it means that the bullet must have gone very fast in both directions. So that's fun. I threw in this piece of blue glass. I have all kinds of colors and pieces of glass. And this is all I have of blue. It's very neatly cornered, so it probably started as a medicine bottle, but in the late 19th or early 20th century. It is a molded plate glass, and it has a bottle-like shape, but it also bends the other way. This was a premium that you got at the gas station in the 1910s, 1920s, that their gasoline was new and different. And so the gas station dealer would offer you a bonbon dish for candies and cakes to have as an incentive to buy 5 gallons of gasoline. It had no other particular purpose. It's obviously just a decorative piece. But I had a number of pieces of it along the way that are quite fascinating. I have two treasures that are really unique in their origin for household use. This is something you would not see anymore. It is a salt cellar, and that had a quantity of salt before you ever got to having a salt shaker. So it's kind of pretty and totally unique in the household that it was, and it's not damaged. And the final treasure in this part of the collection of household ware is the sleigh bell. The sleigh bell, no doubt, was attached to the rig and somehow came loose from the sled. At that point, probably the horse backed up or moved its feet and stepped on the sleigh and pushed it down into the soft mud. And there it stayed for over 100 years. We're not sure what the actual origin of the sleigh bell itself is, but there is etching along the sides of it. So we researched that and found that the design dates from about 1842. And so this may not be quite that old, but it is of a design of that period. And so not only do we have that bell, we have pieces of yet another sleigh bell. Doesn't ring quite as clear, but this is a happy current ending to the household collection of archaeology from Lindencroft. And there's no indication that we have come even close to finding all of the possibilities in the ground around the house and the barn. The next part of the show will deal with farm equipment and how it was preserved. We're not absolutely sure, but the barn at Lindencroft and actually two or three other barns were burned on or about 1919, 1920 by an itinerant workman who liked to see bright fires. So what we have are pieces that are left from the building or have otherwise been associated with the farming. Some of them are directly related, some of them are tangentially related. Perhaps the most interesting to start with is the hinge. And this piece would have been driven into the timbers of the building. And then this strap hinge, which is about 4 feet long, would have been mounted on the pintle of the screw, and then the door could open and close. That's kind of large for a door, but it's fascinating. Part of the rigging for the doors was this odd piece, and it had a cable going through it so that it was affixed to the door and it would slide back and forth. And there were a number of these, so there must have been a number of them attached to sliding doors on the main part of the barn, construction-wise. The band here is significant to American history. Salisbury and Buckingham and Doylestown and Tinicum and so forth were very lush wheat growing areas. And that wheat was brought down to the mills along the river, ground into flour, packed into wooden barrels that had bands like this around the outside to hold the bands together. Then the wheat was shipped either to the West Indies or to England. I suspect it created an international incident, of course, when the revolution came along and we no longer were shipping as much wheat to England because of the war and because of the Enclosure Acts. The Enclosure Acts said that English lords with significant properties could turn their farms into wool and to sheep that took a lot less labor, a lot less cost, a lot greater profit, and England became the wool source of the world. That's fine, but they had to eat too, and the amount of wheat growing declined significantly in England as the millers and the wheat growers and workers moved to America. So this may well have been manufactured here by Englishmen who had emigrated to this country. This is an intriguing piece of much more recent origin. It has been through a number of sources to ask what it is. It is officially called a tine, T-I-N-E, and it doesn't look like anything particular, but it had maybe 10 partners in a row. And down in the cleft in this area here was the cutter bar of a sickle bar that went back and forth cutting wheat in more modern machine age. So this is early 20th century, but is a unique piece of metal design. And now we get to the axes and their origin. The big axe was, whoops, we're still cleaning them out. This is a very hefty piece of work that had a shaft in here, and you had to be a pretty serious man to be able to wield this and use it to cut in the wood yard. I think it's probably right side up like that, yes. But the shaft came out the tump here, and it was found as such. It has been pounded at the end, indicating it has had good use. However, there was a smaller version that looks more like a hatchet. And the problem with this is that it also had a shaft going up here and actually an indentation here indicating that it may have been used as a nail puller in part. But it had a shaft up in here, and somebody used it to chop, and then they got bored chopping, and they pulled the handle sideways and put an undue stress on the enclosure for the shaft, and of course broke the entire retaining iron. So having done that, why they heaved the pieces out in the field and hope never to see them again. But this is a marvelous early lightweight design. The one that matches it in concept is the wedge. And I have personally driven a couple of wedges right on down through cords of wood. And the significance of it is that you drive it in and the log will split eventually. However, whoever had this device got bored about halfway and said, oh, hit it sideways and break the wood apart. They didn't. They broke the wedge apart. The wedge has been broken all along its working edge. So now this piece is useless because it's a butt end rather than a sharp bladed end. So, as usual, it got heaved out into the field for our glory and entertainment. But it shows that people can be impetuous and wreck tools fairly easily. Perhaps the most fascinating piece in the barnyard collection is this scythe blade. The edge is down where my fingers are, and the shaft, the wooden shaft, would have been mounted here. Obviously, the shaft has long since disintegrated, and it's rusted quite through. But I looked at this for a while and said, this doesn't make sense. This should be longer. I have had actual working scythe, and it would be at least 6 inches longer. The one I had is now at the Audubon barn, the other side of Silbury, as a decoration on the wall. But the shaft should have been on the right-hand side, not the left-hand side. And the blade should be longer. What am I looking at? I am probably looking at a left-handed woman's scythe. A weird thought. Scythes are right-handed or left-handed, but this one would have swept this way and then come back and took another bite of hay and so forth. And that's left-handed. And the fact that it's shorter may indicate that it belonged to a woman and was easier to use in the field. At any rate, it's most unusual and most unique, and probably the most interesting piece of farm equipment that we found so far. However, on 50 years of digging, we're only just starting. Who knows what else we'll find? The older part of the house of Lindencroft is thought to be 1735, give or take. So we've set up the table here as we would under normal circumstances with the service of that era. Pewter plates, which are, of course, basically pewter with antimony and other minerals in them. Some people have said how dangerous it is to eat off pewter. And I said, but I eat off the pewter. I don't eat the pewter. This is a typical 9-inch plate made in London. I don't think we have any American plates. Here is a 2-prong fork with a bone handle. This is very common in the early stages before they were able to cast 4-prong forks. And here is looks like a dagger, but is actually a steel knife, which would have been a much improved version of the wooden predecessor. A cup for beverages, a bowl on the other side with the apple in it. The bowl is almost identical to those used on British warships for 100 years. And in the background with pomegranates is a platter of pewter. Would have been very handsome and very valuable in its day. It's still very valuable for Thanksgiving dinner and equivalent events. And we use much of this stuff, maybe not the silverware, but everything else gets used on a regular basis and thoroughly enjoyed. As of about 2000, the year, the future of archaeology is dead on farms like this. The world has changed to pick-up delivery by waste management company, and there will be virtually no throwing of old utensils out into the weeds because the lawn is mowed by much more efficient equipment. So the world has changed again.